Welcome back, Chappelle. Welcome back, Honors. Welcome back, everybody, quite frankly. All right, so in honor of Rally Week, Star-Spangled Sophomores, and all that good stuff, we are going to be sharing this flip together, right? And everybody's going to be getting kind of the same crash course American history, right? Crash course American Revolution, right? And for those of you who are watching right now, for any parents that are watching right now, the biggest thing that some of y'all might be asking yourself is like, well, military, this is America. How come we're just crash coursing the American Revolution? Well, look, check this out. When you're faced with a Western civilizations course, and you have two options, go in depth with the American Revolution and less on the French Revolution, which is the particularly better one, not in terms of better country, better history, in terms of better description of a political revolution following the Enlightenment era. Whenever you're looking at those two things side by side, you want to take the opportunity in a Western Civ course to go really, really deeply into the French Revolution that students in a learning experience would otherwise not offer you in an American class, right? So the biggest thing about it is next year you're going to be going into depth with this as well in your American history classes. But let's go ahead and get after it, all right? I'm going to go ahead and put a timer on so we don't take too much time because it's a crash course, right? And I know some of you are like, top 9, there's 10. Well, yeah, it's top 10. Sorry, I got a little excited. I had to add one more. Now, biggest thing going into this is we're going to be moving quick, all right? And so make sure that you're not writing every single thing down word for word, and we're just kind of glossing over stuff that you probably learned when you were younger anyway, right? So anyway, let's go ahead and get after it, shall we? So the first thing about the American Revolution is it all kind of got started in the Commonwealth period in England, right? Underneath Cromwell. So Cromwell's awful, as we already know, right? Cromwell's a pretty terrible dude, and he decides that he is going to set up these things called the Navigation Acts, right? And the Navigation Acts were a series of laws that actually set in motion that American colonists were only allowed to trade with goods that were coming off British ships. Now, this is giving a shipping and tax collecting and duty collecting monopoly to the British East India Company particularly, right? But also just any British maritime vessel in particular. Now, the thing about it is that the colonists were getting their goods a lot cheaper from the Dutch at the time, right? So, anger level by this point, it's kind of medium, right? So, the Navigation Acts is still just an overreaching thing because American colonists are living on the exterior of Western civilization. There are no urbanized city sectors yet. There are no beefed up political units yet. There are no intense structures there to give them lives that are adequately the same as those in Western Europe. So a lot of these colonists were like, well, look, if we can get goods for cheaper from the Dutch, we should be allowed to do that because we're over here trying to survive while they're over there living in London kicking butt, all right? So they're just like, okay, we're just a little mad about this, but we'll figure it out, even though they're basically ripping us off because if we make a hat here, then they won't let us sell it in England. Whatever. But then, following 1651, going into the early 1700s, there was the French and Indian War, right? Also known as the 7 Years' War in Europe. And as we know, the British defended the colonies in the French-Indian War. The British defended the 13-colony area in the French and Indian War away from French and Native American armies. And also against the Spanish, because the Spanish are going to try and help, push the Brits out as well. But everybody ends up failing, and the British end up winning. But the thing about winning a war is just because you win a war doesn't necessarily mean that it didn't cost a ridiculous amount of money. So in the French and Indian War, granted, the French lost Canada, except for French Canada, but most of Canada, the entire Louisiana territory to the Spanish, this massive area along the Mississippi River to the Brits. Well, the British are still now going to be 140 million pounds, which is their economic currency, right? We have the dollar, they have the pound, right? They're going to be 140 million pounds in debt. That's doubling their national debt following this war. It was only 70 million pounds going into it, right? And how do governments try to get money as fast as they can? They tax people, right? So This is going to begin a series of taxes that the American colonies felt were outright ridiculous, outright unfair, outright overzealous, and outright rude, right? So the first one is going to be like the Sugar Act, and then there's going to be some up and downs with some other acts and things like that. And then the Navigation Acts were some examples of that as well. Well, the biggest one that is studyable in a sense, I'm going to go ahead and leave my noggin up here. The one that's most studyable is the Stamp Act, which was from 1765 to 1766, right? Which was a huge tax on all printed materials, legal documents, anything printed on paper had a huge excise tax on it through the British government, right? This is the actual stamp that they would smack on stuff, meaning that it had been taxed. This is the political one. So during this whole period, you got to understand, there's a lot of political uproar, right? A lot of the colonists are starting to get really, really mad. They're starting to get really, really angry. And this is during the era of mass publications. So they're starting to release propaganda, like political cartoons and stuff like that. So this is one of the cartoons that was actually published in some of like Benjamin Franklin's earliest newspapers. This is the place to affix the stamp. And it's like the death to the colonies, right? Now, the result of the Stamp Act is going to be massive amounts of opposition, right? Huge riots, violence, particularly on tax collectors, and then a very famous phrase known as no taxation without representation. Now let's explain the violence real quick. So there ended up being this group called the Sons of Liberty, and they started leading these raids where they would beat up, tar, and feather tax collectors. See the like feathers on this tax collector? And they're pouring hot tea down his throat, right? So that's a big one. And then also not to mention the fact, too, that there was this phrase, no taxation without representation. Basically, the colonies were saying, you cannot tax us like this if we don't have representation in the parliament. We deserve seats in the parliament, right? That's what they wanted. They wanted representation in the House of Commons, but they didn't have any. So they just started chanting, no taxation without representation. This is ridiculous, and da-da-da-da-da. They're starting to get really angry, and they're starting to lead riots and protests and stuff. And then in one night in Boston in 1770, a massacre occurs, right? Tensions are growing, and there's this kid and this British soldier, and then the kid's like, hey, you didn't pay my boss the money you owed him. He starts poking him in the chest like this. And then like the guy's like, I need you to back up. The British soldier's like, I need you to back up. And then the kid's like, hey, everybody, this guy's trying to rip me off. And then like all these people in Boston start showing up, and they start yelling at these British officers. And then 8 more British soldiers show up, and then no one knows what happened for sure. But we're all pretty confident that people started throwing snowballs and sticks and rocks at the British soldiers, taunting them into shooting at them, and then accidentally one of them let off a shot, and then the rest of them released their fire as well, killing 5 people in a crowd that were completely unarmed, right? Now, 2 of them were killed immediately. 3 of them died of later wounds. One of them was actually the first African-American to lose his life in this entire war effort, Crispus Attucks, which is a really cool one. But the thing about it, some of you are like, well, like we talked about the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in France. That killed 30,000, possibly 40,000 people. How is this a massacre? If you call it a massacre, it looks much better in the newspaper, right? So, because that's the thing. Mass publication was the result of this. Paul Revere himself actually painted this, or drew this entire, what's the word I'm looking for? Political cartoon, which was printed, reprinted, and shotgunned all over the colonies, right? Saying, look at the British troops and what they're doing to us. Look at how they're shooting into crowds of innocent people, killing a child even, right? This publication is going to create extreme amounts of tension, right? And a lot of these colonists are going to start lobbying like, no, you got to like let us do what, blah, blah, blah. So this also created a huge amount of tension, particularly between the Massachusetts colony and the British, right? So then what's going to result is this other crazy event that sets up even more tension between the Boston area and the Massachusetts colony and the Brits, right? Because in 1773, about 3 years later, the Tea Act comes down. Because here's the thing, what the Tea Act was the British imposed heavy taxes and gave the East India Company, owned by the British East India Company, a monopoly on the shipment of tea, right? So coming out of the Indian like areas of which they owned in India and Asia, right? So they started selling it at a very high cost. And the thing about it is the colonists are addicted to tea, right? The thing, like, you got to understand, during this time period, tea became like a genuine addiction for many British people. It actually led to the Opium Wars in China and like several other things. But it was an addiction because like it was a part of their culture, it was part of their habits, it was part of their daily routine. Also the caffeine in it, like everybody really wanted it, right? So the Tea Act, though, imposed these heavy taxes. And again, the colonists could get it cheaper from the Dutch, right? Now, ironically enough, this is going to lead to a lot of people refusing to buy British tea, and they would only buy smuggled tea, right? Tea brought in from the Dutch by pirates and people like that, or privateers, as I like to call them, because they're legit. Now, the Boston Tea Party, though, is going to be the result of this, right? When the Sons of Liberty, that group that was just attacking tax collectors and covering them in tar and feathers and making them drink hot tea water, the Sons of Liberty and those members dress up as Native Americans, and they throw expensive East India Company tea into the Boston Harbor, destroying all of it, right? They're like, you want to tax us on this product? How about you're about to lose this product? And they start dumping it into the Boston Harbor and destroying it at a big event known as the Boston Tea Party, right? And everybody was like, this tea might taste better, but I'm still going to dump it out. Because out of opposition, they were like, you need to let us freely trade and do our own thing, right? Now, what's going to end up happening, though, is this is going to lead to the first Continental Congress, right, in 1774. So the Continental Congress was the first meeting of all the colonies to get together. Well, 12 of them anyway. All right, so because British people, the British government is like, they destroyed our entire shipment of tea. They're not paying their taxes. They're baiting our soldiers into shooting at them. They're doing all this other stuff. Let's punish the Massachusetts colony. Let's punish the Massachusetts colony specifically with these things called the Coercive Acts, is what they called them. And what they called them in the colonies were the intolerable acts. So let's talk about these two words real quick. Intolerable means that you can't tolerate it, that it's messed up and it's awful. Coercive means you're trying to convince somebody to do something. You understand what I'm saying? So the intolerable acts are ridiculous. All right, so like they're absolutely insane. They're taxes on products like paint and glass and like anything that they can try and make this money up for that they lost on this tea. It's just high taxes on regular household goods, right? And back in Britain, they called them the Coercive Acts because they were trying to teach Massachusetts a lesson, right? And the result of this meeting, though, at the Continental Congress, they're going to take place in Philadelphia, they're going to have a meeting of the 12 colonies' delegates. And they agree at this meeting, they were like, you know what? They want to tax us. Let's refuse to buy their goods. We're only going to buy from the Dutch. We're only going to buy from the French. We refuse, and they boycott British goods. This is going to lead to some of the earliest fighting in the American Revolution, right? The shot heard round the world, right? You ever heard this one before?
Boston town, and the shot heard round the world was the start of the revolution. The Minutemen were ready on the move.
Yeah. All right, so anyway, now, that's a Schoolhouse Rock song, right? The shot heard around the world were the first shots let off at the battles of Lexington and Concord, right? Because of the Intolerable Acts and because of the British, or the Boston Tea Party, and because of the First Continental Congress, the British were sensing that there was a good and solid chance that the colonists were going to revolt against them, right? So they started sending a huge amount of British regulars there. And they were starting to unload in the Boston Harbor, right? They were starting to get off. And this guy, amongst three other people who actually rowed much further than he did, this is Paul Revere, started going around not saying the British are coming because he wouldn't say that, right? Because the British were already there. So he was saying the regulars are coming, the regulars are coming. Everyone, look, the regulars are coming. Because the British were trying to get to Concord where there was a huge, massive stockpile of gunpowder and guns and stuff like that that could actually outfit a colonial army should they need to actually go to war, right? And so about 70 Minutemen met the British soldiers at a bridge in Lexington and started letting off shots. And the shot heard around the world, right, was this huge event in American history because it was the beginning of the American Revolutionary War in 1775, right? And some of you are like, well, we haven't even gotten to some of the bigger events yet. That's right, girls. I think you got to understand is that the Revolutionary War started earlier than you think. It actually started before the Declaration of Independence and before all these other events, right? Because that was when the colonists finally had enough. They were like, we cannot stay with Britain anymore, right? And then people like this guy, Thomas Paine. Oh, like, gotta jot that guy down. It's very, very important, right? Common Sense by Thomas Paine was a pamphlet released after the shots at Lexington and Concord, after the war had already begun. A pamphlet. Sound familiar? Remember Martin Luther had a pamphlet war as well, right? Pamphlets were a big deal during this time period, right? Now, issued by a guy named Thomas Paine that advocated that it is common sense that the colonies revolutionize against Britain and separate themselves completely, right? The result of this is going to be a massive sensationalism. It's going to get printed and redistributed all over the 13 colonies. And so the colonists and the Continental Congress and the Founding Fathers are now going to find massive support for this war, and people start entering militias and joining up as fast as they possibly can. And then, in 1776, drafted up by Thomas Jefferson, approved and reread by Benjamin Franklin, and edited by John Adams. In 1776, war is in full swing, and there's a second meeting of the Continental Congress in Independence Hall in Philadelphia, which I have been to numerous times. They sat down and they formally declared the U.S. independent from the British government, and they all signed the Declaration of Independence. John Hancock signed it particularly big because he wanted to make sure everybody saw him, right? So, and then apparently the Liberty Bell rang. That's not necessarily true, all right? We don't know that for sure, but that's why the Liberty Bell is such a big symbol, because they're like, oh, they rang it the second they signed the Declaration of Independence. We don't know that. There was already a crack appearing inside of it. They may not have actually rang it at the time, you know what I mean? But it served as a symbol of independence and freedom ringing. Let freedom ring, right? So it served as that big marquee moment, even though maybe it didn't necessarily ring at the time. But the Declaration of Independence was also a declaration of war. On July 4th, 1776, some delegates signed it. A bunch of them didn't sign until August. One of them didn't even sign until November, right? But we formally declared ourselves independent, which is then going to lead to a massive Revolutionary War, right? The Revolutionary War raged on from 1775 to 1783 until the British finally surrendered at the Battle of Yorktown, right? Now, so looking at this, as you can tell, this is Washington crossing the Delaware. As you can see, he's breaking through ice, and he's trying to get over this Delaware River. This is New Jersey over here. He's crossing the Delaware River into Pennsylvania, where he's going to sneak up on a bunch of German soldiers that are actually really, they had partied way too hard the night before on Christmas Eve, and they were all kind of hungover, and he was going to go show up and beat them up. They're called the Hessians. All right, so now, but this was a tough war, right? Climatological stuff like ice and really hard winters affected the Continental Army, who were not properly outfitted for a cold war, and it also went up and down the entire time, and the British were much more experienced. But at major battles like Trenton and Saratoga, the Continental Army was able to use their home field advantage, and also this militia setup and guerrilla-style warfare to win the American Revolutionary War. And the Treaty of Paris would be signed in 1783. When the United States of America would become a completely autonomous country, away and free of British rule, right? That right there are my top 10 events of the entire American Revolution. But as you can tell, it follows the revolutionary model. Extreme dissent, upset, public's mad, Enlightenment ideas start coming in about free economies and free trade. We'll talk about the Enlightenment thinkers that specifically affected this war before we get into France. Ba-da-da-da-da-da-da. And then now America is a revolutionized free country. And this is actually a painting from the signing of the Treaty of Paris. The British delegates that showed up to sign the Treaty of Paris refused to pose for the painting, so it was never actually finished. So I think it's kind of funny. But yeah, that's where we're going to stop. That's Crash Course American History. I hope honors and regular and academic all enjoyed that. I'll see you guys later. Y'all have a good one.